The Night of the Watchman. Since I accepted the job as a security guard in that old abandoned building, I felt that something didn't fit. The company had bought the property to remodel it, but until then, someone had to watch to keep intruders or looters out. The night of my first shift was cold and silent, too silent. The building was a sleeping monster, with long, dark hallways, broken windows letting the wind in, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks, but soon I realized that feeling was much more real and terrifying than I could imagine. The beginning of this nightmare started when, after several hours without incidents, my radio static became impossible to ignore. I heard an intermittent whisper, almost inaudible, saying my name with a broken voice, as if coming from another time. I turned on the flashlight and began to walk through the hallways, trying to find the source of that sound, but I only found echo and darkness. As I advanced, the walls seemed to close in, and the cold pierced to the bone. At the heart of this story, things got worse. I saw fleeting figures at the edge of my vision, shadows that disappeared when I turned around. My heart was pounding, and the radio now repeated nonsense words, mixed with muffled laughter and moans. I felt someone following me, but every time I stopped, the silence became unbearable. I decided to go up to the top floor where the old surveillance room was, looking for a camera or any sign of human presence. There, among dusty monitors and yellowed papers, I found an old notebook with handwritten notes. Reading carefully, I discovered that the previous watchman had mysteriously disappeared, and since then several guards had quit or fled terrified. The notebook mentioned a legend that in that building a tragedy had sealed the soul of a man trapped forever, and that anyone who tried to watch it would be marked by his despair. At that moment, the door slammed shut, leaving me trapped. The flashlight flickered and went out. In total darkness, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder and a whispering voice urgently calling me. I tried to scream, but only a muffled whisper came out. It was then that I understood I was not alone, that something else inhabited those hallways, something that did not want me to leave. The radio came back to life for a few seconds, and I clearly heard, "You will not leave." Desperation overwhelmed me, and I started banging on the door, begging for a way out. Finally, I managed to open it and ran down the stairs without looking back, until I reached the entrance, where the streetlight brought me back to the real world. The outcome came weeks later, when I was fired for abandoning my post. But the worst was not losing the job, but discovering that I had left something behind. At night in my apartment, I hear the radio static with that persistent whisper, calling me, reminding me that the trapped watchman is still with me, that his shadow will not leave me in peace, and that the night I spent in that building was only the beginning of a curse I will never break. The nights became endless, and the feeling of being watched slowly consumed me. I tried to get rid of the radio, but it always reappeared in my room, turned on and vibrating with that spectral voice. My friends began to notice my change. My eyes reflected a deep fear, and my voice trembled when I told fragments of that experience. One night, on the verge of collapse, I decided to return to the building, this time armed with cameras and recorders. I wanted to confront what was stalking me, to break the cycle. A Upon entering, an icy cold wrapped around me and the shadows seemed to whisper my name. I went up to the top floor where it all began and found the notebook again, open on a page I hadn't seen before. A message that said, "You are not the first, nor will you be the last." Then, a presence materialized in front of me, and I understood that some secrets are meant to remain hidden, and some souls trapped forever. The shadow on the monitor. Every night, Eduardo sat at his guard post in the basement of the corporate building, surrounded by screens showing every corner of that tower of glass and steel. It was a monotonous, silent job, but also lonely. The hours slipped by slow and heavy, and the darkness seemed to absorb every sound. However, there was something about those nights that felt different, as if the routine was just a facade for something hidden behind the shadows. The first time he noticed it was while checking the parking lot cameras. In one of the images, a dark figure moved among the parked cars, but when he switched the camera to focus better, the shadow disappeared without a trace. He thought it was a system error or some interference, but he couldn't help feeling a chill. That same night, while making his rounds, he heard footsteps behind him, slow and rhythmic. But when he turned around, he found no one. Silence wrapped the hallway again, and Eduardo wondered if loneliness was starting to play tricks on his mind. In the following days, the appearances became more frequent. On the monitors, the shadow appeared and disappeared in different places in the building: the break room, the fourth-floor hallway, the main entrance. Sometimes it seemed to watch him, and other times it vanished just as he pointed the camera at it. His heart pounded hard, but he never dared to leave his post. One night, while checking the entrances, the figure appeared on the screen showing the empty lobby. Eduardo blinked, and in an instant the shadow crossed the revolving door and entered the building. Without thinking, he ran to the elevator and pressed the button to go up to the lobby. Upon arrival, the place was deserted. The lights flickered weakly, and an unexpected cold pierced his bones. Suddenly, he heard a whisper, a barely audible murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Unable to make out words, the voice grew more insistent, a call that drew him toward the emergency stairs. He climbed step by step, breathing heavily and skin prickling. Upon reaching the rooftop, the shadow was there, floating in the gloom, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Eduardo stared at it, paralyzed by a mix of fear and fascination. The figure had no clear features, but its eyes shone with an intense red glow, as if they held an ancient fury. Then, the shadow spoke with a deep, resonant voice that echoed through the night. "You have seen what no one should. Now you are part of this place, like me." Eduardo wanted to step back, but his legs did not respond. The shadow advanced toward him, and a spectral hand touched his forehead. At that moment, images flooded his mind. Dark secrets of the building, stories of missing employees, pacts sealed in secrecy. It was as if the shadow transmitted forbidden knowledge that bound him forever to that tower. Suddenly, he came to his senses, fell to his knees, and breathed with difficulty. Silence reigned again, and the shadow vanished, leaving only a cold, heavy sensation. Eduardo returned to his post, but he was no longer the same. He knew the secret no one suspected, and he knew that every night the shadow would return, waiting for him to fulfill his part of the pact. Now, watching the monitors, he not only guarded the building, but also made sure the darkness would not be unleashed completely, because he understood that the true threat was not outside, but in the shadow that now dwelled inside him. The cameras began to fail frequently, showing interference and figures that brushed reality. Eduardo felt an invisible weight on his chest, a presence that followed him relentlessly. He knew the pact had marked him, and soon the shadow would demand more than vigilance, his soul. The shadow on the night shift. Every night when the clock struck 12, the corporate building was plunged into a silence that could almost be felt like a weight. I, Marcos, was one of the security guards responsible for watching over that gigantic maze of offices and hallways that stretched across 5 floors. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and kept me out of trouble. However, that routine that seemed safe began to break one ordinary night, when the shadows stopped being just absence of light and became something much more tangible, threatening, impossible to ignore. That night had started like any other. I was walking the floors with my flashlight and radio, checking that the doors were locked, that the cameras were working, and that there were no intruders. But upon reaching the 4th floor, something caught my attention. In the north hallway, where normally there were only echoes and the hum of the air conditioning, I sensed a presence. There was no one there, but I felt that someone or something was watching me from the dark end. I advanced cautiously, and my flashlight illuminated a barely visible figure, standing next to one of the vacant offices. I stopped, ready to call my colleagues on the radio, but the figure vanished in the blink of an eye. I thought maybe it was my imagination playing tricks due to fatigue, but then I heard a whisper that came from nowhere in particular, a weak and raspy voice that called my name. I quickened my pace and checked all the offices, but they were empty, the windows closed, and there was no one else on the floor. I resumed my rounds, trying to convince myself it was nothing, although the cold I felt had nothing to do with the temperature. The next night, I decided to bring a recorder to capture any anomalies. As I walked down the east hallway on the 2nd floor, the voice was heard again, but this time clearer, as if it were right behind me. I turned quickly, but only found my face reflected in a glass door. The recorder picked up a deep sigh and a murmur that said, "Don't leave." I wanted to respond, to say I was there to protect, but fear paralyzed me. That same week, other guards began reporting strange occurrences, lights turning off and on by themselves, footsteps on empty floors, metallic sounds without visible origin. The security cameras showed blurry images, fuzzy figures that vanished when someone tried to approach. Management decided to install additional sensors and reinforce the night rounds, but nothing calmed the growing sense of unease that spread like a dark stain through the building. One night when the clock struck 1, I received a desperate call over the radio. It was Luis, one of my colleagues, saying he was trapped in the basement, unable to get out. I ran to the place, but upon arrival found the door open and the basement empty. Luis was nowhere to be found, and his radio only emitted static. While searching for signs, I felt an icy hand touch my shoulder. I turned abruptly and saw a dark shadow, shapeless, that seemed to absorb the light around it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow vanished, and at that moment the electrical system failed, plunging everything into total darkness. When the light returned, Luis appeared at the main door, confused, not remembering how he had gotten there. From that moment on, his behavior changed. He was distant, with a lost gaze, and sometimes muttered incoherent things about voices calling him from the darkness. I decided to investigate the building's history and discovered that in that basement years ago, a guard had died under mysterious circumstances. His body was found weeks later, and it was said that his spirit never left the place, trapped in an endless cycle of watchfulness. That revelation made me understand that what we faced was not just a presence, but an entity condemned to repeat its torment, and that maybe, like him, we were being dragged into that same prison. The last night I worked there, I knew I could no longer ignore the shadow lurking in the hallways. I turned off my radio and ventured into the basement with a candle and an old photo I found in the archives, the face of the deceased guard. I whispered a prayer for his rest and promised to watch over the building so no one else would suffer as he did. The shadow appeared once more, but this time it neither attacked nor paralyzed me. It just stood still as if thanking me. Gradually, the strange phenomena ceased and calm returned to reign. I left the job shortly after, but even today, when I pass near that building, I feel an invisible gaze following me, a reminder that darkness is sometimes not absence but presence, and that there are those who watch even beyond death.